Hey everyone, today I want to talk about hard aspects between the moon and Neptune in a birth chart. And the hard aspects that I'm going to be focusing on in this video are the conjunction, the square, the opposition, and the inconjunction. And I'll start off by talking about some similarities that they all have, and then I'll talk about individual differences that I've noticed in my astrological research between each of the aspects. So there are quite a few commonalities between all Moon Neptune aspects, specifically the hard aspects for this video. And one of the big ones is that they are all very emotionally sensitive. They also struggle with their awareness of their own emotions and others' emotions. So people with the hard aspects are more prone to misunderstandings, misunderstanding themselves, misunderstanding other people, and that's because the hard aspects also struggle with boundaries. They can be very giving, like they are very compassionate, they can give a lot of themselves. They're very empathetic. With the hard aspects, sometimes they might give in order to fulfill a certain Neptunian fantasy or because of guilt, because they don't realize that their intentions or their goals behind their generosity or behind their empathy, it's not always clear or realistic. People with hard aspects from Moon to Neptune can also easily lose themselves in others or in Neptunian things. So like music, art, spirituality, religion, escapism, drugs, alcohol, things like that. And part of losing themselves in these Neptunian things is because they're trying to escape their feelings. That's another big commonality between all the hard Moon Neptune aspects. And with the hard aspects between Moon and Neptune, you want to look at the sign of the moon, because the sign is going to show you either what they're escaping into or what they're escaping from, like what they're avoiding. And with all hard aspects between Moon and Neptune, usually it shows that their mother or mother figure or whoever played that nurturing role for them could have herself been very emotionally sensitive, maybe even emotionally unstable. She herself might have struggled with boundaries or her own escapist tendencies, like maybe she herself was an addict or completely absent or even just kind of avoidant of her motherly duties. She also could have been more needy or dependent on either the child or other people to care for her. Or she could have, again, because if she struggled with boundaries, she could have also been a little bit overly involved with her child. The mother could have also had unrealistic ideals or expectations of the child, the person who has the hard aspect between Moon and Neptune. So in a way, she wasn't always fully present. People who have hard aspects between Moon and Neptune might have felt a little unseen, like she didn't really see or understand her child's feelings. Therefore, that kind of creates this lack of clarity with the individual who has that Moon Neptune aspect. It's almost like they weren't attuned to all the time. So they themselves as parents, the people who have these hard aspects between Moon and Neptune, they themselves can struggle with that as well with their own children. They might struggle with boundaries with their kids, proper discipline. They might struggle with being very sensitive to their own parenting fears, perhaps giving too much, also being that parent that's very involved, or maybe they can struggle with being fully present with their kids, especially if they haven't learned to really confront and sit with their emotions. It's going to be very difficult and challenging for them to really sit with and be present for their child's emotions. I'll kind of go into them now individually. I want to start with the conjunction. I'm including the conjunction as a hard aspect because it is very complex to understand, or even for the individual themselves who has this aspect to recognize is happening, because conjunctions, the planets are together. They are very bonded together. It's very difficult for them to feel their emotions without this Neptunian cloudy influence over their feeling state. They operate together and simultaneously, so it's very hard for an individual with the conjunction between Moon and Neptune to separate the two. So they are very emotionally sensitive, and they can lose themselves in their emotions more than any other moon Neptune aspects. The other hard aspects you'll see with what I describe, they tend to try to avoid their emotions more. And while the moon conjunct Neptune also does that avoidance or escapism, it's actually kind of harder for them to do that. They tend to lose themselves in their feelings, but that is what creates this greater lack of clarity around their emotions. Their emotions become their way of escaping. But what's interesting is that they don't realize that this is happening because they feel their emotions strongly. Like, they're very sensitive. They're like the emotional sponges. And because of that, they also sink into other Neptunian things to escape those emotions, but they don't realize that the more that they try to escape, the more that they're actually losing themselves in their emotions. And that, I think, is the biggest challenge with the conjunction. So for example, spiritual bypass is strong with the conjunction. I've noticed that among all the hard aspects, I think the moon conjunct Neptune tends to show up in people who are strongly attached and lose themselves in a particular belief system or like a mission, a cause that almost gives them comfort from reality. They struggle with that guilt that maybe they're not doing enough or giving enough. And they can escape into this mission or spiritual cause or whatever it is. Let's say, for example, that's coming from feeling guilty for not giving enough. The more that they give, then the more that they're kind of giving into their guilt. That can be unclear for them, and they can sometimes give too much. Moon Neptune hard aspects aren't necessarily as selfish as other hard aspects to Neptune, but I think among all of these hard aspects that I'm talking about in this video, the conjunction is probably the one that has maybe the most pure motivations behind their generosity. I think that they really do feel like they want to give and be generous. I think they just struggle with sometimes giving too much, and again, not having that clarity within themselves. It's hard for them to know what's actually them and what they're escaping into. So they can be a little bit more emotionally unstable because, again, it's hard for them to find a solid ground because the moon already naturally is ebbs and flows, waxes and wanes. So mix that in with Neptune, this planet that is kind of all encompassing, that makes the moon, which is already kind of an unstable planet, even more unstable. But the conjunction can be more intuitive, I think, than the other hard aspects. Not as much as the easy aspects, but they can be more intuitive because there's more awareness of others' emotions. They can be more sensitive and in tune with other people than the other hard aspects. But again, that's only to the level that they are aware of their own emotions, which is why this one can be so challenging. Sometimes people with the conjunction can also be very moved by music and art and things like that, and be very affected by suffering in the world, and they themselves can suffer more in isolation. It's suffering in the sense that sometimes, again, they can lose themselves within their emotions and feel very sensitive to things in the world, especially the harsh elements of the world. So that's why they can have a lot of compassion, but again, they don't always recognize how they don't recognize themselves. That's the tricky part. Now I want to talk about the square. With the square, there's more of an obvious escapism. They will easily try to escape into things. There's a tension between their moon, which is their feelings, and Neptune, which is their fantasy. Because of that, it's hard for them to move away from Neptune to be in their moon. Whereas the conjunction is kind of feeling their emotions, but it's all unclear because it's in this like Neptunian soup. The square is like they're in their Neptune to avoid being in their moon. They also struggle to have that clarity with their moon, but it's because they are actively trying to avoid their feelings. Which means that the square, I think, from what I've noticed, struggles the most with disappointment. Being in their moon feels disappointing because they have to sort of be with themselves, and it's hard for them to really accept and sit with their emotions, which is why they're escaping. And I've noticed that the square seems to escape more in relationships. They escape into like art, music, spirituality, religion, things like that as well. But I've noticed that they tend to want to find somebody to lose themselves in. So they project a lot onto their partners, especially men with moon square to Neptune in their chart. They project a lot onto their female partners. All that hard aspects between moon and Neptune can show more of like that anxious attachment style or a little bit more clingy, but I think you see it the most with the square, just from what I've noticed in my research. And I think the square sometimes has more unclear motivations behind their compassion or their generosity. They're usually giving in order to, again, fulfill that Neptunian fantasy. So for example, in a relationship, maybe they're giving of themselves in order to have a partner to fulfill this Neptunian fantasy of whatever relationship they idealize. And you can see this with all the moon hard aspects to Neptune too, but I've seen it especially with the square, where they had to be the caretaker for their mom a lot of the times. The mom was more needy and dependent, so they almost had to be very in tune with the mom. And this is what set in that disappointment. They didn't feel seen, and so now they're trying to lose themselves in something Neptunian to find that reconnection to themselves, but they don't realize that they're actually kind of running away from themselves and they're actually avoiding themselves. So that's the biggest challenge with the square. Now I want to talk about the opposition. And this one again shows that same sensitivity, but this one can be more intense with the moon opposite Neptune because they are more sensitive to their environment and to external things around them, because oppositions are by nature projected outside of ourselves. So their interpretation of the environment is not always clear. The way that things feel for them, the way that they're affected by their environment isn't clear. It hits more on like sensitivities or insecurities that they have, which makes them interpret the external world in a way that, again, is determined by the sign of the moon. And their way of escaping is through that projection. They're escaping through a projection onto something that is outside of themselves. And it's similar to the square in that way, but it's different in that it's more sensitive to environmental circumstances. So it's almost quicker to rush into that Neptunian projection or that Neptunian escape or fantasy because they're trying to avoid that sensitivity that they feel. And they're trying to stabilize their emotions by using Neptunian means, but it actually makes them less emotionally stable. And sometimes they don't recognize that. And this creates more feelings of insecurity, which creates them to want to escape even more. So again, oppositions, they're always kind of up and down and back and forth. You have to have the balance between oppositions, and that's what they're trying to find. They're trying to find balance through escapism and Neptune, and they can actually achieve this balance more so than the other hard aspects. They are able to find a balance between fantasy and their emotions, escapism and their emotions. But they first have to be aware of how they swing from one to another, how when they sit with their feelings, they swing to the other end of trying to escape and finding themselves through Neptunian ways, which doesn't mean that they ever really form that connection to themselves. If they work through this and are able to recognize what's me, what's my projection, what's my fantasy, then they can develop the ability to use Neptune and their moon in a way that balances them both. So Neptune can end up being like a medicine for them, something to aid or to help them, not their cure, if that makes sense. The other hard aspects are using Neptune as if it's their cure, but then losing connection to themselves and their feelings with the opposition. They are probably more likely to recognize when to use Neptune as a medicine without losing contact with their moon. Lastly, the Inconjunction. This is where you see the more extreme tendencies to avoid their emotions. It's an extreme giving of themselves. It's an extreme giving up of one's emotions and boundaries. They go to more extreme ways to disconnect and escape from their emotions. And they tend to not be aware of this. With the square and the opposition, there can be problems that they come to face with that can bring that awareness to them that there's a Moon Neptune challenge going on. The Inconjunction, it's almost like they even escape that self-awareness. So they can be more out of touch with themselves. They can be more disconnected with themselves and disconnected with their own feelings. This avoidance is masked very well with some kind of story. You'll hear some kind of story of a Neptunian ideal. Inconjunctions in the birth chart are interesting because they show some frailties or like a weakness. With this one, it's a more extreme feeling of vulnerability and going to, again, greater lengths to avoid it. But because of that, you can actually see like physical effects of this avoidance. I've seen this aspect show up in people who have like digestive issues, or like a general disconnection with their body. They can't feel what their body's feeling. There's more numbness, there's more disassociation even. And again, sometimes that can be through like drugs, alcohol, substances, just like other Moon Neptune aspects. But with this one, it doesn't have to be something addictive. Like they can even just have a hard time being in their own body. With Moon Neptune hard aspects, there's like a constant search for source, for something to give them substance. And again, because it's Neptune, it's not clear what that is. And it's like the more that they try to find it, the more that they actually disconnect from the true source, which is themselves. And so with the Inconjunction, this can show up in how they treat their bodies. Like food has to be particular, or they can be kind of picky or struggle to eat certain things, or to even notice when they're hungry or when they're full. Their moods also affect their digestion a lot, and they go to greater or more extreme lengths to minimize their own feelings. And again, that's how they're trying to avoid it, especially if they feel like a negative feeling. You'll see people with the Inconjunction downplay their sensitivities or them feeling hurt. They could even minimize or deny their own health issues or their own mental health issues. And again, all of this is to avoid their feelings. And especially if they have like hard Pluto aspects in their chart, this is probably going to be a stronger theme. If the moon is also making a hard aspect to Pluto, or any other planet is making a hard aspect to Pluto, they will go to greater lengths to appear strong and to deny their sensitivities and their vulnerabilities, to kind of run away from themselves. So the Inconjunction is a tough one, but these challenges can definitely be worked through. They just have to be aware that it's happening. And with all Moon Neptune aspects, I think somatic work can be really helpful. Things that help them get in touch with their body. You want to start with the body because that helps you get in touch with your emotions, which is what people with hard aspects between Moon and Neptune need, is they really need to sit with their feelings and really understand themselves from the inside out, which is something that they're trying to avoid, like with the square, opposition, and Inconjunction, or like with the conjunction. They might not be trying to avoid it, but just feel like they're drowning in it and not have that clarity when they're in it. Moon Neptune aspects can produce a lot of creativity. I mean, there's a lot of like artists, celebrities, people in Hollywood that have hard aspects between Moon and Neptune. So there's definitely some gifts to it. I mean, there can be a lot of sensitivity and vulnerability and compassion and empathy and creativity for sure. It's just, we got to get clear on who we are, what we feel, and what our body feels. And I think that can definitely help with some of those challenges. So let me know what your experiences have been, if you have any hard aspects between Moon and Neptune, or what you've noticed in people with hard aspects between the Moon and Neptune. Thank you for watching. I will see you next time.